Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Caddo Lake. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the spring of 1925, Caddo Lake sat half-swollen from seasonal rains, its shoreline blurred into a maze of cypress knees, floating grass, and dark water channels that shifted with the wind. County maps struggled to define its edges. Locals said the lake decided its own boundaries. What was solid ground one month might be water the next. 5 fishermen arrived there in late April, traveling from nearby towns in East Texas and western Louisiana. According to dock permits and bait shop receipts, they were familiar men, brothers, cousins, neighbors, used to working shallow waters and navigating tight channels. None were strangers to the lake, though none claimed to know it fully. Caddo Lake had a reputation even then. Before the area would later be formalized and protected as what became Caddo Lake State Park, it was a place of contested use: fishing grounds, logging routes, moonshine paths, and informal borders between jurisdictions. Sheriffs on both sides admitted privately that enforcement was difficult. The water did not respect county lines. The men launched their boats just after dawn on April 22. Weather reports describe the morning as still, humid, with low cloud cover that flattened sound. A ferry operator recalled seeing the boats separate, each taking a different channel, a common practice meant to cover more ground before midday heat set in. None of the 5 returned. Concern did not rise immediately. Delays were common, engines failed, nets tangled, the lake encouraged patience. But by the second evening, families began comparing absences. By the third, the sheriff's office received its first formal notice. Search parties went out at first light. What they found unsettled even those accustomed to the lake's dangers. All 5 boats were located within a narrow radius, drifting slowly, engines off, nets still wet. There were no signs of collision or struggle. Gear remained intact. Lunch tins were unopened. And around each boat, witnesses reported the same detail: alligators, gathered in unusual numbers, floating motionless in loose rings, as if holding position rather than hunting. Deputy Harold Winslow, whose affidavit would later circulate between counties, wrote that the animals showed no agitation, no feeding behavior. When approached, they did not scatter immediately. They drifted away slowly as though released from something finished. No blood was visible. No bodies surfaced. Local newspapers hesitated in their language. Early headlines spoke of accidents, then silence. Editors consulted with officials before printing anything further. One editor wrote privately that the lake did not want the story told loudly. By nightfall, rumors had already begun to take shape. Some blamed sudden sinkholes beneath the water. Others spoke of entanglement in illegal trot lines. A few mentioned the lake's older habits, how it swallowed things without returning them. What united the accounts was uncertainty. The boats had come back. The men had not. And the lake, thick with cypress shadow and still water, gave no indication of where to look next. By the 4th day, the search expanded beyond routine procedure. What began as a local effort drew in deputies from both sides of the Texas-Louisiana line, along with volunteer fishermen who knew the back channels better than any map. Official reports note that coordination was hampered by terrain, a careful phrase that failed to capture how the lake resisted being searched at all. Caddo Lake did not behave like open water. Cypress groves broke sightlines. Floating islands shifted overnight. Nets dragged through one channel came up clean, while the same net snagged thick roots in another that had appeared navigable the day before. Searchers described the sense of moving through a place that rearranged itself quietly. The 5 fishermen were identified formally in county notices: Thomas Hale, Edgar Hale, Louis Montreux, Benjamin Price, and Samuel Price. 2 sets of brothers, all between 23 and 36 years old. All known as steady workers. None carried reputations for reckless behavior. One widow later told a clerk, "They were not the kind to leave boats behind." Each boat was examined in detail. Engines showed no damage. Fuel tanks were partially full. Anchors were stowed, not deployed. In one vessel, a half-rolled cigarette lay in the ashtray unlit. Another held a pocket watch stopped at 10:17, though no one could say whether it had stopped that morning or years earlier. The Alligators drew the most attention. Game wardens were called to assess whether an attack could explain the disappearances. Their assessment was cautious. While the lake held a healthy population, attacks on grown men were rare, and the lack of blood or damaged boats argued against it. One warden noted in his field book that the animal's behavior was curiously passive. As the days passed, sightings of the same phenomenon repeated. Whenever one of the boats was located again after drifting, alligators were present, spaced evenly, not jostling or feeding. A volunteer remarked, half joking, that it looked like they were waiting. That remark did not make it into the official report. Newspaper clippings from Shreveport and Marshall began circulating more freely, though the details varied. Some papers claimed 3 boats, others 6. Some said the men had been drinking. Families disputed this sharply. Contradictions multiplied, blurring the facts rather than clarifying them. By the end of the first week, the sheriff ordered draglines pulled. Nothing came up. No clothing, no tools, no remains. The lake offered nothing that could be catalogued. Privately, officials discussed the difficulty of jurisdiction. Caddo Lake lay across boundaries, much like the park designation that would later attempt to organize it. Even then, as early plans for conservation were discussed, plans that would eventually lead to the creation of Caddo Lake State Park, the same issue arose: how to manage a place that did not behave consistently. A minister who accompanied one search party recorded a brief note in his journal: "This water does not rush, it holds." He did not explain what he meant. By the 10th day, the search slowed. The boats were secured at dock. The men were declared missing, not deceased. Families waited for the lake to give something back. It did not. And as the first week ended, a quieter fear took hold, not that the fishermen had drowned, but that whatever had taken them had done so cleanly enough to leave no disturbance behind. As April gave way to May, the lake entered a different mood. The water warmed, insects thickened the air, and the cypress groves grew heavy with new growth. For searchers, these changes complicated everything. Visibility worsened. Draglines snagged more often. The sense that time itself was working against recovery became difficult to ignore. County records show that by the second week, responsibility for the search shifted subtly. What had been a coordinated effort dissolved into smaller, quieter attempts. Individual families hiring fishermen to look in specific channels, deputies revisiting spots already cleared, game wardens conducting brief patrols without expectation. The language in the reports changed from searching to monitoring. One affidavit, submitted by Raymond Ives, a fisherman who volunteered his boat, described an odd sound heard just before dawn while drifting near Big Cypress Bayou. He wrote of a low, steady movement beneath the water, not splashing, not feeding. When his lantern illuminated the surface, several alligators were present again, aligned loosely along the edge of his boat. Ives admitted the animals did nothing threatening. They were just there, he wrote. The affidavit was accepted but never referenced again. Attention turned briefly to human causes. Rumors of illegal fishing operations and moonshine routes surfaced. Some suggested the men had stumbled onto something they should not have seen. Deputies questioned known operators along the lake's edges, but no evidence connected them to the disappearances. No boats had been damaged. No gunshots reported. No one claimed an argument or threat. A fisherman named Calvin Moore told the sheriff that Caddo Lake had dead water, places where currents sank instead of flowed. He suggested the men might have stepped off their boats into one of these pockets. When asked why their bodies had not surfaced, Moore replied, "Some things don't come back up." The statement was recorded without comment. By mid-May, the boats themselves became objects of scrutiny. One had faint scuff marks along the side, consistent with contact against cypress roots. Another showed a rope recently untied, its fibers still tight, not waterlogged. Investigators could not determine whether the rope had been used to secure the boat or something else entirely. Newspaper interest peaked and then receded. Editors grew cautious, aware that speculation outpaced fact. One paper printed a short retraction, stating that reports of animal attacks were unconfirmed. Another stopped coverage altogether, citing lack of new information. Privately, some officials began referencing older incidents, men lost in the lake decades earlier, never recovered. None matched this scale. None involved boats returning empty, undisturbed. The clustering of alligators remained unexplained. A deputy, in a letter to his brother, wrote, "It's as if the lake finished something before we arrived." The letter was not part of the official file. By the end of May, the fishermen were presumed dead, though no declaration was issued. Families were advised to settle affairs quietly. Memorials were held without graves. The lake resumed its routines. Boats passed through the same channels. Nets were set again. Alligators drifted where they always had. Yet those who worked the water noticed something subtle had changed. Certain areas felt avoided, not by rule but by instinct. And whenever a boat idled too long in still water, someone would glance at the surface, half expecting to see the slow, patient ring form again. By early June, the official posture of the case hardened into something closer to acceptance. County correspondence shifted toward practical matters, storage of the boats, compensation claims, death benefits that could not yet be issued. The word vanished appeared more often than missing. It was an important distinction, though no one said so aloud. Each boat was hauled onto dry land and examined again, this time by men who knew the lake less well than the fishermen who had disappeared. They measured hulls, tested engines, catalogued nets. Nothing suggested panic. Nothing suggested flight. One deputy remarked in his notes that the boats looked paused, as though left briefly with the intention of returning. Personal effects were inventoried and returned to families. Watches, hats, a pair of gloves stiff with dried lake water. One widow later told a clerk that receiving the items unsettled her more than their absence. "If they plan to come back," she said, "then where did they go?" Attention turned briefly to the shoreline. Searchers combed campsites and fishing clearings for signs the men might have come ashore voluntarily. They found nothing recent. Fires were cold. Footprints belonged to searchers themselves. A game warden noted that even the wildlife showed little disturbance along the banks during the days in question. Around this time, a short article appeared in a regional bulletin discussing the lake's ecology and its unusual stability. It mentioned the extensive cypress groves and floating islands that made navigation unpredictable. The article also referenced early efforts to formalize protections for the area, efforts that would, years later, result in the establishment of Caddo Lake State Park. The implication was subtle, that the lake required management because it resisted ordinary control. Among locals, conversation shifted toward older explanations. Some spoke of sudden sinkholes beneath the waterline, places where entire trees had vanished overnight. Others referenced what they called holding water, areas believed to trap objects indefinitely. These ideas were shared without urgency, more as inherited knowledge than speculation. One account, recorded later as testimony, came from Mrs. Lillian Brewer, who lived near a narrow channel where one boat had last been seen. She claimed to have heard voices calling across the water that morning, then nothing. When asked why she had not reported it sooner, she replied, "It sounded finished." The phrase puzzled investigators. No further clarification was given. By mid-June, organized searching ceased. Deputies maintained periodic patrols, but the intensity was gone. The lake offered no new signs, and the weather erased what little might have remained. Still, the pattern of the alligators lingered in memory. Fishermen spoke quietly of how the animals had behaved, not feeding, not scattering, but waiting. No one could explain it. No one wanted to. As summer deepened, the water returned to its ordinary dangers. Accidents occurred. Storms rolled through, yet none echoed the earlier disappearances. The 5 men remained the lake's only unanswered question that season. And as the boats were finally released back into use or sold off, those who took them out again reported the same sensation in certain channels. A heaviness, a pause, as if the water itself remembered stopping once and had not entirely resumed. Summer settled fully over Caddo Lake, bringing heat that flattened sound and slowed movement. The official search was over, but inquiry did not end so cleanly. It changed shape. What could not be recovered began to be reviewed instead. Old ledgers, ferry logs, handwritten notes that had never been intended to matter. A clerk in Harrison County revisited river traffic records from the week of the disappearances. 5 boats had launched. 5 boats had been found. No other vessels were logged as crossing those same channels during the critical hours. That absence unsettled him more than any anomaly. In places like Caddo Lake, someone was almost always moving. Attention returned briefly to the men themselves. Investigators compiled short profiles from employer statements and church records. None of the five were known to have enemies. None were involved in disputes that could explain coordinated harm. Their families overlapped socially, not financially. There was no shared debt, no insurance benefit that would have motivated foul play. One detail did emerge. All five had fished the same narrow corridor repeatedly over the previous month, favoring a stretch locals referred to simply as the Still Reach. It was not marked on maps. It did not always exist in the same place. Fishermen described it as a calm band of water that appeared without warning and vanished just as quietly. A letter from a retired fisherman, written years later but referencing this period, described the Still Reach as water that forgets to move. He claimed nets set there came up heavy, not with fish, but with pressure, as though lifted from deeper than expected. The letter was never attached to the official file. In July, one of the recovered boats was sold to a new owner from Shreveport. On its first outing, the engine stalled repeatedly near the same area where it had previously been found drifting. The owner reported a sudden gathering of alligators nearby, fewer than before, but close enough to notice. When he restarted the engine and moved away, the animals dispersed. He did not return to that channel. By late summer, small details began to fade from public memory. The exact number of alligators, the order in which boats were found. Newspapers no longer mentioned the case. What remained were impressions rather than facts. A deputy wrote in his personal notebook that the case had failed not because of lack of effort, but because the scene would not hold still. He crossed the sentence out, then rewrote it more carefully. Environmental instability prevented conclusions. As August ended, the lake looked ordinary again. Fishermen returned. Alligators basked where they always had. Nothing suggested a disturbance remained. And yet, among those who worked the water daily, an unspoken adjustment had taken place. Boats avoided lingering in still water. Nets were pulled sooner. And when the lake grew too quiet, engines were restarted, not out of fear but out of habit. Because something about that spring had taught them a lesson they could not articulate. And Caddo Lake, which had given nothing back, did not contradict them. As autumn approached, the lake entered its quieter season. The humidity lifted slightly, and mornings carried a thin fog that blurred distances and softened edges. It was during this time that officials revisited the case one final time, prompted less by new evidence than by the need to close files before the year's end. A joint memorandum between Texas and Louisiana authorities acknowledged what everyone already understood. No physical evidence existed to support prosecution. Accident rulings remained speculative, and recovery was unlikely. The memorandum concluded with a phrase that appeared repeatedly in later correspondence: environmental factors predominate. It was a way of assigning responsibility without naming an agent. Still, individual attempts to understand the vanishings continued. A biology instructor from Marshall requested permission to observe alligator behavior near the locations where the boats had been found. His notes, later referenced in a regional journal, described the animals as unusually tolerant of proximity during that period. He suggested seasonal factors, though he admitted the clustering behavior was poorly explained by feeding patterns alone. His study ended inconclusively. At the same time, a former ferry operator named Leonard Briggs offered a late statement. He claimed that on the morning the fishermen vanished, he heard what sounded like oars striking wood repeatedly, slow, deliberate taps coming from a channel where no boats were visible. He assumed it was sound carrying oddly over water. By the time he thought to mention it, weeks had passed. The statement was filed but not pursued. In October, one of the 5 boats was quietly dismantled for parts. The mechanic who worked on it later told a reporter that the hull showed unusual stress along the underside, as though it had rested against something firm beneath the surface for an extended period. When asked what that might have been, he shrugged. "The lake's got its own floor," he said. "Not all of it's where you expect." Families marked the missing men privately. There were no public memorials. Churches held small services without bodies, without dates carved in stone. Wives and parents continued to refer to the men as absent rather than dead. By November, even informal searching ceased. The lake shifted again, as it always did. Floating islands broke apart. Channels closed and reopened elsewhere. Whatever configuration had existed that spring was gone. Yet a final detail surfaced before the year ended. A boy fishing near a narrow inlet found a knife snagged in reeds, a plain fillet blade, heavily worn, its handle smoothed by use. The blade bore no rust, as if kept clean. No one could say whether it belonged to one of the fishermen. The knife was turned in, logged, and stored. It was never claimed. When winter came, the lake grew still in a different way. Fewer boats ventured out. Alligators retreated to deeper water. Fog lingered longer in the mornings, and though no one said it openly, there was a shared sense that the moment for answers had passed. Whatever had occurred in the spring of 1925 had done so completely, leaving behind only objects and impressions. The men were not found. The lake did not explain itself. And the water, thick with shadow and cypress roots, seemed content to keep its boundaries undefined, just as it always had. In the months that followed, the case settled into a quieter phase, one marked less by investigation than by recollection. County offices still held the files, but they were no longer opened routinely. When they were, it was usually by someone new to the job, unfamiliar with the lake, who quickly learned that the documents raised more questions than they answered. Early in 1926, a small article appeared in a regional outdoor journal, reflecting on the hazards of inland waters. It mentioned Caddo Lake only briefly, noting its shifting channels and dense vegetation. Yet readers familiar with the previous year's events read between the lines. One letter to the editor asked whether recent losses had informed the piece. No response was printed. Local fishermen continued to trade stories, but these accounts grew less specific with time. Details blurred. The ring of alligators became many gators, then simply animals. The still reach was remembered as bad water. Names were spoken less often. The lake absorbed them. One notable exception came from Joseph Lang, a trapper who claimed to have crossed paths with the fishermen the morning they vanished. In a sworn statement taken nearly a year later, Lang recalled exchanging a few words with Thomas Hale near a narrow channel. Hale had reportedly remarked that the water felt heavy that day. Lang dismissed it at the time. Only later did the phrase trouble him enough to speak up. Lang's statement conflicted with earlier timelines, placing the men farther east than previously believed. Deputies attempted to reconcile the discrepancy, but the lake's mutable geography made precision impossible. Channels moved, landmarks shifted, even locals disagreed on names. Around this time, discussions resumed quietly about formal conservation of the area. Advocates argued that regulation might prevent future accidents. Critics countered that the lake resisted management. The debate echoed older tensions, long before the land would be officially organized as Caddo Lake State Park, when jurisdiction itself felt provisional. In the absence of answers, folklore began to fill the gaps, not dramatically but cautiously. Some spoke of submerged forests that caught boats and held them fast. Others described sudden drops where sound vanished and depth changed without warning. A few mentioned the lake's habit of returning objects while keeping people. None of these explanations gained official standing. By the end of the year, the 5 fishermen had become part of local memory rather than current concern. Their families remained, adapting as best they could. Some moved away. Others stayed near the water, unwilling or unable to leave. What endured most strongly was a change in behavior. Fishermen began traveling in closer proximity to one another. Engines were kept running even while nets were checked. And whenever the water grew too calm, someone would remark on it, not as a warning but as an observation that carried weight. Because in places like Caddo Lake, calm was not always reassurance. Sometimes it was the lake deciding to hold something again. By the start of 1927, the case had drifted far enough from public attention that only periodic events pulled it back into view. One such moment came when a professor of natural sciences from a small Texas college requested access to weather and water level records from the spring of 1925. His interest, he said, was academic, an attempt to correlate unexplained incidents with hydrological changes. The records showed nothing dramatic. Water levels were high but not exceptional. Currents were slow. Wind speeds were minimal. The lake, on paper, appeared calm. The professor noted in his correspondence that this absence of extremes complicated any explanation based on accident alone. He suggested that stillness itself might be misleading in a body of water as complex as Caddo Lake. During his visit, he interviewed several fishermen who had participated in the original search. Their recollections were consistent in tone, if not in detail. Each spoke of a feeling that the boats had been left deliberately, not abandoned in panic. One man described the scene as interrupted, as though something had paused the fishermen mid-action. That same winter, a maintenance crew clearing brush along a rarely used shoreline found a section of net tangled deep in cypress roots. The net matched the type used by the Hale brothers, though no identifying marks remained. It showed no tearing or damage consistent with animal struggle. Instead, it appeared cut cleanly at one end. The fragment was logged and stored, then later misplaced. A game warden reviewing old notes added a marginal comment: "Alligator activity inconclusive. No feeding signs." The comment echoed earlier assessments and offered no closure. As months passed, the fishermen's names appeared less frequently in conversation, replaced by references to the location itself. People spoke of that spring or that water, allowing the place to stand in for the event. This shift seemed intentional, a way of acknowledging what had happened without reawakening it. In late summer, A boating accident unrelated to the case resulted in a single fatality elsewhere on the lake. The body was recovered within hours. The contrast was noted quietly. The lake, it seemed, could return what it took when it chose to. A retired deputy later remarked that this was what unsettled him most. It wasn't that the lake was dangerous, he said. It was that it was selective. His comment was never recorded officially. By the close of 1927, the 5 fishermen were rarely mentioned in public forums. Yet their absence had reshaped local habits in ways that persisted. Routes were altered. Certain channels were avoided without explanation. New fishermen learned quickly which waters were considered unreliable, though no map showed them. Caddo Lake remained active, productive, and outwardly unchanged. Alligators basked where they always had. Boats passed through familiar paths, but beneath the routines lay an adjustment, one that assumed the lake did not always act according to human expectations. And in moments of deep stillness, when the water flattened and sound seemed to pause, those who knew the story felt it return, not as fear, but as awareness that something had once been taken cleanly, and that the lake had never been required to explain how. In early 1928, the case resurfaced unexpectedly through a matter of routine bureaucracy. While consolidating old correspondence, a clerk in Marion County discovered a misplaced envelope marked simply Caddo, April 25. Inside were carbon copies of telegrams exchanged between sheriffs during the first week of the disappearances. None contained new information, but their tone was revealing, measured, restrained, and notably absent of urgency after the initial 48 hours. One message, sent on the 3rd day, read, "Boats recovered. No disturbance noted. Proceeding cautiously." Another followed hours later. "No further action advised until water changes." The phrasing suggested an early recognition that the lake itself dictated the pace of inquiry. That same spring, a fisherman named Alonzo Price, cousin to one of the missing men, attempted to retrace the original routes alone. He left before dawn and returned before noon, visibly shaken but unharmed. When asked what he found, he said only that the channels no longer aligned with memory. "It's like the water corrected itself," he told his wife. He never attempted the journey again. Around this time, local folklore began to crystallize, not into legends but into rules. Certain bends were avoided at dawn. Engines were kept running even while nets were checked. Anchors were dropped sparingly. These practices were taught quietly, without reference to the men who had vanished. The lake's past was folded into technique. A small fire destroyed part of a bait shop near Mooringsport later that year. Among the items lost were handwritten notes left by fishermen over decades, observations about currents, depths, and hazards. The owner remarked afterward that some things were meant to be remembered without paper. No investigation followed. Academics continued to show intermittent interest. A graduate student writing on inland water disappearances requested interviews in 1929. He was met with polite refusals. One fisherman told him, "You're asking the wrong questions. We don't want why. We want when not." The student left without material. By the decade's end, the 5 fishermen existed primarily as an absence. Their names appeared on church rolls without dates of death. Their boats had long since changed hands. Only families marked the anniversaries, and even then, quietly. Yet the lake retained a reputation that newcomers sensed quickly. Guides warned clients against drifting too long in still water. Game wardens noted unusual clustering of wildlife in certain seasons but recorded nothing abnormal. Everything could be explained, just not together. And so the case moved forward not as a mystery to be solved, but as a condition to be managed. Caddo Lake continued to give fish, roots, and livelihoods. It simply asked in return that certain questions be left unasked. Those who respected that arrangement worked the water without incident. Those who lingered too long in the quiet learned, sooner or later, why the lake had never offered answers in the first place. By 1930, the disappearances of 1925 had slipped beyond the reach of active memory, replaced by a quieter form of acknowledgement. The files still existed, but they were no longer consulted. The lake itself had become the reference point, its behavior studied, its moods noted, its silences respected. That year, a regional conservation committee circulated early proposals aimed at limiting logging and regulating fishing along sensitive stretches of Caddo Lake. Though framed as environmental concern, the language hinted at something else, an understanding that certain areas resisted repeated use. One draft noted that human activity in specific corridors appears historically unsustainable. The phrasing drew no objections. A local school teacher, Margaret Allen, assigned her students to map the lake from oral descriptions rather than charts. The resulting drawings were inconsistent, even contradictory. Channels appeared and disappeared between versions. When she asked why, one student replied, "Because it's not the same every time." Allen kept the papers, later remarking that they captured something maps could not. In private correspondence, an aging deputy reflected on the case with a detachment earned through time. He wrote that the men had not been taken violently, but removed by circumstance. The phrase echoed the careful language used years earlier by officials who could not name a cause without evidence. Around this period, several fishermen reported brief engine failures in the same narrow stretches once associated with the vanishings. Each incident resolved quickly without damage. Still, the coincidence was noted. One man commented that the water felt heavy again, reviving a phrase long absent from conversation. Interest in the lake's history revived modestly after a traveling lecturer spoke in Shreveport about inland waterways that resisted settlement. He cited Caddo Lake as an example of a place shaped as much by absence as presence. He did not mention the fishermen. He did not need to. As the decade progressed, fewer people remembered the precise details. The ring of alligators became an image rather than a fact. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. Others insisted it had been understated. No photographs existed to settle the matter. By the mid-1930s, the lake had resumed its role as provider and boundary. People adapted to its rhythms. Accidents happened and were resolved. Bodies were recovered when they should have been. The 5 men from 1925 remain the exception. And perhaps that was what lingered most powerfully, not fear but contrast. The knowledge that the lake was capable of behaving normally, even predictably, made the earlier silence harder to dismiss. Caddo Lake had shown that it could give back what it took. It had simply chosen not to once. And the water, dark and patient beneath the cypress canopy, gave no indication that it felt obliged to explain that choice. In 1932, a quiet attempt was made to revisit the events of 1925 under the guise of administrative review. A new county judge, unfamiliar with the case but thorough by reputation, requested summaries of unresolved matters predating his term. The fishermen were listed under presumed lost, environmental factors. The phrasing was precise and empty at the same time. The judge asked to see the boats. By then, only two were traceable. One had been broken down for parts. Another had been sold and resold until its history dissolved into ordinary use. The remaining two were located in private hands, still operating along the lake's safer routes. Their owners reported no incidents, though both admitted they avoided certain channels without knowing exactly why. A clerk accompanying the judge noted that when the boats were mentioned by name, fishermen grew quieter. Not defensive, just careful. Around this period, a series of handwritten journals surfaced briefly in a second-hand shop near Jefferson. They belonged to a now-deceased fisherman who had worked Caddo Lake since before the First World War. One entry, dated weeks after the disappearances, read, "Water held too steady today, wouldn't drift, wouldn't scatter." The journals were purchased by an unknown buyer and never seen again. In 1934, a hurricane far south of the region altered rainfall patterns across East Texas and Louisiana. Caddo Lake swelled again, briefly reclaiming land thought long settled. Old channels reopened. New ones formed. During this period, searchers from years earlier remarked privately that the lake resembled its 1925 configuration more closely than at any time since. Nothing surfaced. No tools. No remains. No new boats. The resemblance unsettled some more than discovery would have. A state wildlife officer, writing years later, recalled patrolling during that season. He described alligator behavior as ordinary, territorial, feeding normally, responsive to disturbance. "Nothing like before," he wrote. The comparison stood alone on the page. By the mid-1930s, the fishermen's names had faded from official discourse entirely. Their families carried on. Some moved inland. Others remained near the water, living with an absence that had never been given shape. What endured instead was a shared understanding among those who worked the lake, that certain conditions invited loss, not recklessly, not violently, but thoroughly. And when those conditions returned, still water, low wind, muted sound, boats did not linger. They moved on, because Caddo Lake had once demonstrated that it did not need force to take men from the surface. It needed only time, patience, and the willingness to close quietly around them. By 1936, the case had settled into what officials referred to privately as a closed silence. There was no resolution to announce, no error to correct, and no pressure to reopen what had resisted inquiry for over a decade. The files remained, but they were consulted only as examples, cited when discussing why some cases could not be forced into conclusions. That year, a small academic conference in Nacogdoches included a paper on inland lakes and human disappearances. Caddo Lake was mentioned briefly, not by name at first, but by description. A bi-state wetland with shifting channels, heavy cypress growth, and inconsistent recovery rates. When the name was finally spoken, several attendees reportedly nodded in recognition. No debate followed. One attendee, a geographer, later wrote that Caddo Lake functioned less like a body of water and more like a system, one that absorbed disturbance unevenly. His notes suggested that certain conditions could create zones of near stasis, areas where movement slowed dramatically both above and below the surface. He did not claim this explained the fishermen. He only noted that such zones would not announce themselves. Back on the lake, older fishermen began retiring in greater numbers. Those who remained taught newcomers practical habits without context. Avoid drifting too long. Keep engines warm. Do not anchor where the water feels thick. These instructions were given without story, as if stories themselves risked attracting attention. A single incident in late autumn drew brief notice. A duck hunter reported losing sight of his partner for several minutes in a narrow channel. The man reappeared unharmed, confused, insisting he had not moved. Both men abandoned the hunt immediately. No report was filed. By the end of the decade, the 5 fishermen of 1925 existed only in scattered references, church notes without death dates, family Bibles with margins left blank, county indexes marked with question symbols. Their absence had never been formalized into certainty. And yet, Caddo Lake had not repeated itself. Accidents happened as they always had, but they resolved predictably. Bodies surfaced. Boats were damaged. Causes could be named. The singular nature of the 1925 event grew sharper with time, not duller. Some suggested that whatever conditions had aligned that spring had not returned. Others believed the lake had already taken what it required. No one proposed testing either idea. As the 1930s closed, the lake continued its quiet work, feeding cypress roots, sheltering wildlife, offering roots to those who learned it carefully. And beneath that continuity lay an understanding shared by those who had inherited the memory. That Caddo Lake did not act randomly. It waited. And when it chose to close around something, it did so without leaving marks that the surface world could read. As the 1940s approached, the case slipped fully into the margins of official memory. The county courthouse underwent renovations, files were reorganized, and older cases were condensed into brief summaries meant to preserve space rather than detail. The fishermen were reduced to a single line. 5 men lost on Caddo Lake, April 1925. No remains recovered. Nothing more. Yet memory persisted elsewhere. In 1941, a local historian named Paul Renshaw began collecting oral accounts from families living along the lake's edges. His aim was not to investigate crimes, but to document how the lake shaped daily life. Again and again, conversations drifted back to that spring. Not to the men themselves, but to what followed, the changes in behavior, the avoidance of certain waters, the sense that something had been learned collectively. Renshaw recorded one fisherman saying, "The lake showed us a boundary, not where we couldn't go, but where we shouldn't stay." The remark appeared in Renshaw's notes without commentary. During this period, the federal government renewed interest in wetland preservation. Discussions revived earlier ideas that had eventually led to the formal recognition of Caddo Lake State Park. Planners emphasized the lake's ecological uniqueness, but some locals privately suspected another motivation. That regulation provided a way to impose structure on a place long known to resist it. No one opposed the idea openly. That same year, a fishing guide reported seeing a brief clustering of alligators near a drifting skiff during a still morning. The animals dispersed when the engine restarted. The guide mentioned the sighting only in passing, later admitting he did not want to give the lake ideas. His phrasing echoed older habits of caution. As war drew attention elsewhere, fewer people worked the lake regularly. Activity declined. Silence returned more often. Yet nothing was taken. Nothing vanished. The lake remained still but uneventful. Renshaw concluded his work with a reflection that would not be published until after his death. He wrote that Caddo Lake functioned as a keeper of absences, a place where loss did not always announce itself as tragedy, but as subtraction, quiet, precise, and complete. He did not claim this explained the fishermen. He did not attempt to resolve anything. By the end of the year, the case existed only where it always had most strongly. In habit, in avoidance, in the way boats idled briefly and then moved on when the water grew too calm. The lake had not repeated its silence, but it had not forgotten how. The war years altered the rhythm of Caddo Lake in ways that had nothing to do with mystery and everything to do with absence. Younger men left for service. Fuel was rationed. Fishing slowed. Large stretches of the lake went days without boats crossing them at all. For the first time since 1925, the stillness returned regularly, but without incident. Some took comfort in that. Others found it unsettling. In 1943, a wildlife survey conducted jointly by Texas and Louisiana noted unusually stable alligator populations, with no evidence of aggressive clustering behavior. The report framed this as ecological balance restored after years of fluctuation. An older warden, reviewing the draft, penciled a quiet note in the margin: "Balance is not the same as peace." The note was omitted from the final version. During that same summer, a pair of loggers navigating a shallow channel became briefly grounded when their skiff stopped responding to current. One man later described the sensation as floating without drifting. The moment passed within minutes. They did not report it formally. They did not return to that route. After the war ended, activity resumed slowly. New families arrived, unfamiliar with the lake's habits. Guides took care to instruct them in practical terms: where to fish, where not to linger, which stretches of water required attention even in calm weather. These lessons were framed as safety, not superstition. In 1947, a small museum in Marshall acquired a collection of local artifacts. Among them was a rusted compass said to have belonged to one of the missing fishermen. Its needle was fixed permanently southward. The curator displayed it briefly, then removed it after visitors remarked that it made them uneasy. No explanation was given. That unease never coalesced into panic. Instead, it settled into something quieter, a sense that the lake responded best to restraint. Those who respected its rhythms prospered. Those who pressed against its stillness learned to move on. By the late 1940s, the fishermen of 1925 were rarely named aloud. They existed as reference rather than memory. The lake's reputation endured not as a place of danger, but as a place of condition, one that required awareness rather than fear. Caddo Lake had offered no answers for more than 2 decades. And yet, as the water shifted and channels reformed, the sense remained that the lake had once demonstrated a capacity for closure, swift, thorough, and silent. That demonstration had not needed repetition. The lake, patient beneath the cypress canopy, continued to wait not for men, but for moments when stillness returned completely. By the early 1950s, the case had aged into something like accepted absence. County clerks no longer remembered who first handled the files. Margins bore handwriting that could not be matched to any living official. Dates were correct, facts unchanged, yet the center of the story felt increasingly unreachable, as if it had slipped behind glass. That decade brought renewed attention to the lake's management. Conservation measures tightened. Fishing permits were limited. Certain channels were quietly designated as restricted, though the justifications cited erosion, nesting patterns, and water quality. Locals noticed that many of these restrictions overlapped with areas once associated, indirectly, never explicitly, with the events of 1925. A fisheries biologist conducting surveys remarked in his field notes that some regions exhibited unusual acoustic dampening, where engine noise and human voices seemed to carry poorly. He attributed this to vegetation density and water depth, though he added that the effect was inconsistent. The note drew no response. During this period, a handful of older fishermen passed away. Their belongings were dispersed. Nets, journals, and tools changed hands. One such journal, discovered briefly during an estate sale, contained a short entry dated April 1925. Saw them drift, didn't wave, didn't shout, just stopped. The page that followed was torn out. The journal was purchased by a private buyer and vanished again. Newspapers occasionally revisited the lake's history in broad terms, celebrating its beauty and complexity. When the fishermen were mentioned at all, it was as a footnote, an unresolved incident among many hazards of early 20th century life. Editors avoided detail. Readers did not press for it. In 1954, a boating accident elsewhere on the lake resulted in 2 fatalities. Both bodies were recovered within hours. The efficiency of the recovery prompted quiet comparison among those who remembered the earlier case. One man remarked, "That's how it usually works." The implication went unspoken. Around this time, a retired deputy was asked by a local student what he believed had happened in 1925. He answered carefully, "I think the lake did what it does best. It kept." When asked what it had kept, he declined to specify. The idea that the lake could keep something without violence, without trace, had become the story's enduring feature. Not loss, but retention. Not chaos, but containment. As the decade closed, the 5 fishermen existed primarily as names passed down in families, spoken softly and without elaboration. Their absence no longer demanded explanation. It had been absorbed into the landscape, into the rules that governed movement and stillness on the water. And when mornings came heavy with fog and the surface lay unbroken, boats did not linger. They moved on. Because long after the searchers stopped dragging the lake, Caddo Lake continued to demonstrate that some moments, once closed, remain closed, not by force, but by patience. In the latter half of the 1950s, Caddo Lake had become something closer to an institution than a location. It was studied, managed, photographed, and described in official terms that emphasized balance and preservation. What it was no longer described as, at least publicly, was unpredictable. And yet, the older habits remained. In 1957, a new generation of game wardens rotated into the area. Most had no knowledge of the 1925 disappearances beyond a passing mention during training. Still, within months, similar observations appeared in their reports. Boats stalled briefly in narrow channels without mechanical cause. Wildlife avoided certain stretches for reasons that could not be mapped. Fog formed unevenly, clinging to specific corridors long after sunrise. One warden, reviewing his own notes, crossed out the phrase "unusual concentration" and replaced it with "localized stillness." The revision was telling. It suggested a shift away from describing what gathered toward describing what stopped. That same year, a recreational fisherman reported losing track of time while anchored near a cypress stand. He believed he had drifted for minutes. His watch suggested nearly an hour had passed. No harm came to him. The report was dismissed as fatigue. Still, the man never anchored there again. Around this period, oral historians recorded a recurring phrase among longtime residents: "The lake closes." When asked what that meant, speakers struggled to explain. It was not seasonal. It was not predictable. It was simply something that happened when conditions aligned: still air, low current, muted sound. Those conditions were said to mirror the morning of the fishermen's disappearance. A brief article in a conservation bulletin described Caddo Lake as a self-regulating system. The phrase attracted interest from scientists, but it also resonated locally for different reasons. Regulation implied choice. Choice implied intent. No one suggested the lake was conscious. Yet no one dismissed the idea entirely, either. By the end of the decade, the case had become what archivists sometimes call closed by duration. There was nothing left to add. No evidence would emerge that time itself had not already erased. But erasure was not the same as forgetting. Those who worked the lake continued to notice when the water behaved differently. When sound flattened, when drift slowed, when the surface seemed to hold rather than move. In those moments, boats restarted engines. Anchors were lifted. Conversations paused, and the lake, wide and dark beneath the cypress, resumed its ordinary rhythms, giving no sign that it objected to being avoided. Because whatever had happened in 1925 did not require reenactment. It required only recognition. By the early 1960s, the 5 fishermen of 1925 existed almost entirely as an omission. Their names appeared in no active records, their case referenced only indirectly in discussions about lake safety or unusual environmental behavior. Yet omission has its own gravity. It pulls attention without announcing itself. In 1962, during a routine dredging survey near the Louisiana edge of Caddo Lake, engineers noted an anomaly beneath the waterline, an area where sediment depth dropped abruptly, forming a smooth depression rather than the jagged contours typical of erosion. The report described it as unnaturally even, then dismissed it as a quirk of water flow. No excavation was ordered. The lake, by then, was protected well enough that disturbance required more justification than curiosity. That same year, a fisherman's son asked his father why certain channels were never mentioned when routes were discussed. The father answered without hesitation, "Those are finished waters." When pressed, he added, "Nothing bad, just nothing more to do there. The explanation satisfied the boy. It had been satisfying people for decades. Academic interest flickered once more when a sociologist studying community memory visited the region. He observed that locals spoke of the disappearances without emotion, as though describing weather events rather than loss. In his notes, he wrote that Caddo Lake represented a rare case where uncertainty had stabilized rather than unsettled a community. The lake's silence had become instructive. No new incidents echoed the past. Accidents occurred and were resolved. Storms took lives and returned bodies. Each ordinary tragedy reinforced how singular the spring of 1925 had been. One final personal account surfaced that year, written by a woman cleaning out her late mother's belongings. The mother had been engaged to one of the missing fishermen. The letter she left behind contained only a few lines. I stopped waiting when I understood the lake did not take them violently. It kept them. No date accompanied the statement. As the decade progressed, fewer people remembered the details at all. What endured instead were the adjustments, routes chosen, habits maintained, silences respected. The lake had taught a lesson without words, and the lesson had outlived the story. Caddo Lake remained a place of work and beauty, its surface broken daily by boats and birds. But beneath that activity lay an older awareness, one that surfaced only when conditions aligned and the water grew too still. In those moments, engines were started, and no one needed to say why. The final trace of the case appears not in a report, but in a margin. In 1971, a maintenance ledger kept by a small lake services office recorded routine work, dock repairs, buoy replacements, channel markers adjusted after storms. One entry, written in a different hand, stood apart. No marker placed in still water, area self-maintaining. No coordinates were listed. None were needed. Nearly half a century had passed since the 5 fishermen vanished from Caddo Lake in the spring of 1925. Every institution that had once searched for them had changed names, jurisdictions, or purpose. The lake itself had been formally protected, studied, and categorized. It appeared on maps now with confident lines and labels, a place defined rather than assumed. Yet definition had not brought explanation. Older residents still remembered the morning the boats came back without men. They remembered how the alligators drifted, not feeding, not scattering, but holding space. They remembered how the search ended not with discovery, but with quiet agreement that nothing more would be given. By the early 1970s, the lake had settled into a predictable rhythm. Accidents occurred and resolved. Storms reshaped shorelines and then receded. When people were lost, they were found. Only the 5 fishermen remained absent in a way that resisted comparison. A retired game warden, interviewed shortly before his death, summarized it simply. The lake never lied to us. We just wanted it to speak. He paused, then added, "It doesn't owe us that." Today, within the memory of those still living at the time, the places associated with the disappearances remain unmarked. No signs warn visitors. No plaques explain avoidance. Boats pass near them daily without incident. The lake allows this. It does not correct anyone. But on rare mornings when wind drops completely and sound flattens across the water, guides still steer away from certain channels. Engines idle only briefly. Anchors are lifted quickly. These choices are made without fear, without discussion. They are made because Caddo Lake once demonstrated something precise and lasting, that it could close around men without violence, without struggle, and without leaving a surface trace. The fishermen were never found. The boats were returned. The water remained. And in Caddo Lake, where boundaries have always been provisional and stillness has weight, the unanswered space where those 5 men vanished continues to exist, not as a mystery demanding solution, but as a silence that has never required correction.